steam ahead, exploring the influence of science fiction on the decision to study STEM. As you know, at iCeGS, we are committed to promoting interdisciplinary research, which connects ideas across fields, and it can be education, careers, art, science. And today's session is a great example of that ethos in action, because we are joined by Sarah, a researcher whose work brings together creative writing, space science, and career studies. She's a second-year PhD candidate in creative writing with an MA in creative writing, a postgraduate certificate in space science, and a BSc SC in open studies with a focus on physics, astronomy, and all from Open University. She also used to be a STEM ambassador and a former astronomy club member with a lifelong passion for science fiction and space exploration. She's raising this fascinating question in her study. What role does science fiction play in inspiring people to study STEM subjects and to continue these related careers? And she has done interviews with STEM professionals in the UK and North America to investigate the stories that shaped their choices. It's a very interesting and fresh approach, and we are looking forward to hear more about it. As including the short story collection that she's created as part of her PhD. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the session. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Hope everybody can see that. Great. Right. Well, my introduction is going to be a little shorter than I intended, because I think Ghazal's just said most of it. But so I'm Sarah. I'm in the second year of my PhD. I'd like to thank Dr. Hannah Blake and iCeGS for inviting me to come and tell you about my research. I approach this area of study from two different areas, both as a writer and lifelong reader of science fiction, and as a scientist. Growing up in the 70s, I was surrounded by the knowledge that science wasn't for girls. And despite the fact that I was quite good at it, I ended up studying the arts, A-levels in English literature, 16th century history and law. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I decided to give science a go, which, strangely enough, I was inspired not by science fiction, but by a medical drama to study medical sciences, which quickly morphed into other things. My interests were so varied that I switched from a natural sciences degree to the open degree with the Open University, because it allowed me to explore different aspects of science. And I ended up with an open degree covering various things, including physics and astronomy, but also human biology, maths, photography, business, and creative writing. Doing the Masters confronted me with the decision: did I continue with science in the form of a space science Masters or the creative writing Master? So I started both and ended up with a Masters in creative writing and a postgraduate certificate in space science. I'm a STEM ambassador and a fellow of the British Interplanetary Society, the Royal Astronomical Society, and I'm a member of the Initiative for Interstellar Studies. I firmly believe that the future of the human race is in space. The background to my project: the world is in the midst of a STEM crisis. Not enough young people are choosing to study STEM subjects. In the UK alone, a shortfall of over 173,000 workers, with an estimated cost to business of £1.5 billion per year. In the US, the Semiconductor Industry Association forecasts a shortage of approximately 1.4 million technicians, computer scientists, and engineers by 2030. Governments, educators, and industry are all looking for ways to address this issue. And as I'm sure you guys are more than aware, there are as many answers as there are questions. There are some claiming that there is no crisis, and others pointing that numbers of people studying STEM are on the increase, but not, it seems, at a pace that's keeping up with demand. In an ever more technological world, it stands to reason that there will be an increasing requirement for people trained in STEM. Excuse me. Why science fiction? There's much anecdotal evidence from famous STEM professionals on how science fiction influenced them to want to study STEM. Gregory Chamitov, NASA astronaut, was inspired by Star Trek and even took a replica phaser into space with him on the last flight of Endeavour in 2011. Carl Sagan, whom many of you may have heard of, was a scientist, writer, and presenter of the television series Cosmos. He wrote an article in the New York Times that said, "Science fiction has led me to science," and was a strong proponent. He said, oh, sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. There's some very noisy stuff going on behind me. I don't know if you can hear it. Apologies if you can. Sagan once said that science fiction made him ask questions, but it didn't answer them, which made him want to go out and find the answers himself. Robert H. Goddard, father of modern rocketry, said he was inspired by reading H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. Igor Sikorsky, the inventor of the modern helicopter, was inspired by Jules Verne's Robert the Conqueror. Miguel Alcubierre loved Star Trek and actually developed a theoretical basis for an actual warp drive. And finally, Frank Borman actually wrote a letter to Jules Verne's grandson, telling him how his grandfather could be considered a pioneer of the space age, as the astronauts of Apollo 8, Borman, Lovell, and Anders, the first men to leave the gravitational field of the Earth, had all been inspired to their careers by reading Jules Verne's novels. Having been a lifelong fan who went on to study science later in life, this made me ask whether science fiction could be directed to encourage STEM as a career choice. As a STEM ambassador, I've attempted to engage young people via a science fiction creative writing workshop that I developed. From feedback forms distributed after the workshop, 26% of students had changed from having no interest in STEM to considering it as a career. This is an avenue I continue to pursue alongside my writing and the PhD. This all led to the construction of a PhD research project looking at the influence of science fiction on the career choices of a sample of STEM professionals. The literature. My literature review has three main prongs: STEM career aspirations, the influence of science fiction on STEM career aspirations, and science fiction literature itself. I won't bore you guys too much with the literature on STEM career aspirations, as I'm sure you all know far more about it than I. But I have looked at so far the Interest and Recruitment in Science project, or IRIS, which asked why young people, particularly women, chose STEM. It focused on several areas: achievement-related choices, narrative psychology, and gender and feminist perspectives. I find the narrative psychology aspect particularly relevant as the science fiction community, science fiction fandom, science fiction conventions, etc., are all contributory to a science fiction identity. The concept of STEM identity led me to various avenues of research. The paper, Early Informal STEM Experiences and STEM Identity, The Importance of Talking Science by Du et al., looked at the early experiences of students who had parents who were scientists, science hobbies, or parental encouragement. These factors were deemed at least as important as educational factors in determining STEM persistence. One point the paper notes is that while the literature on early informal STEM experiences is growing, there is a paucity of studies that provide an understanding of the relative impact of different experiences on future persistence outcomes. Although they did find that the consumption of science fiction in the form of books and television, among other factors, were predictive of a strong STEM identity at college level. I enjoy it a bit, but I wouldn't want to do it in the future. Pupil Aspirations for STEM Careers in Lower Secondary School by Smith et al. Finds that despite initiatives intended to increase STEM participation at higher education levels, many students just do not see themselves as scientists. The main conclusion drawn from this was that pupils saw science as difficult and only for clever people, and they often had a misconception about what being a scientist was, with many pupils saying that they wouldn't be a scientist, but they would consider being a doctor. So if we can give them STEM identity and accurate role models through the reading of science fiction, then we may be one step closer to encouraging more STEM participation. And I have recently come across the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics prize survey and have been given access to the data, although I have not yet attempted to analyse it. And of course, I haven't mentioned there, but you can see the image of it. The crucial impacts on career choices by your own department is a paper I'm looking at too. The influence of science fiction on career aspirations. Information on this field is more anecdotal than informed by research. As mentioned in my introduction, many people have stated that science fiction has inspired them, but there isn't much actual research. In a Physics World article, John Ogborn of the Institute of Physics is reported to have said, setting science within interesting narratives is crucial to keeping students involved, and he believes that the use of science fiction could help reverse the fall in number of students studying physics. One person who has investigated this area in a more measured way is Elizabeth Stanway, an astronomer at the University of Warwick. She completed 2 basic surveys of the astronomical community that suggested there was a strong link between science fiction and science aspirations. 69% of respondents indicated that science fiction had influenced their career or life. A follow-up to this study was conducted by Samuel Bossier in France and drew similar conclusions, although he also noted that the French were less influenced than the British, with only 46% saying it had been influential. Both studies were done informally, questionnaires to scientists at a conference. However, this doesn't invalidate the data and is perhaps representative of the field itself. A cautionary tale from Barnett et al. Tells us that science fiction needs to be good and accurate, which in order to further the aims of science. As a scientist and writer myself, I find the incorrect use of science annoying. And if it is science fiction, regardless of the genre, the science should be right. Movies tend to be worse offenders than literature, but the science fiction author is not immune to hand-wavium. As a writer, I appreciate that actual science is often boring or unbelievable, but as a scientist, there should be a way to represent it more accurately than is presently achieved. Making science compelling and realistic should be a priority. There are ways to achieve this. One of the interviewees I worked with runs a workshop called Launchpad, where he teaches science to science fiction writers. Science consultants can also be engaged, and one of the interviewees had acted in this role. Research into responses to science in TV shows and movies, such as Orpheus, How Does Science Fiction Television Shape Fans' Relationships to Science? And Are People Inspired by the Big Bang Theory to Find Out More About Science? Suggests that watching science fiction engenders both a step towards STEM identity and engaging the curiosity of the watchers. Orpheus' questionnaire-based study revealed that of the Doctor Who viewers who took part, 13% said that the show had influenced their education choices, and 9% had been influenced in their career choice. Lee and Orthia noted that the Big Bang Theory had the potential to stimulate interest in science, and that over a quarter of the 74 participants were inspired to investigate the science they had seen in the show. Something that came across from numerous interviewees was that awe and wonder were inspirational. Sense of wonder is a concept often referred to within both the fan and the science fiction community. The Encyclopedia of Science Fiction has a 2-page entry, and Brave New Worlds, the Oxford Dictionary of Science Fiction, describes it thus: a feeling of awakening or awe triggered by an expansion of one's awareness of what is possible, or by confrontation with the vastness of space and time, as brought on by reading science fiction. Finally, science fiction literature itself. Work on science fiction as literature allows us to understand the forms that science fiction can take, which informs any hypothesis on how science fiction may influence people to develop an interest in science. Darko Suvin is one of the most significant theorists of science fiction. He views it as the literature of cognitive estrangement. Cognitive as in a rational examination of phenomena, as opposed to the acceptance found in myth, and estrangement because the presentation of the difference between the real and fictional worlds sheds a new light on the real, a commentary not of the reality but on it. Suvin's theory surrounds the use of what he refers to as a novum, or a totally new idea which encourages us to look at our world in a different way. Cheryl Vint offers a good grounding in various views of the genre in Science Fiction for the Perplexed. Defining science fiction has always been difficult, but Vint quotes Damon Knight. science fiction is what we point to when we say it. And I think this is a very apt description. Your view of science fiction may be completely different from mine, and none of them are wrong. Although she does qualify who are we and what is being sought in the pointing. Science fiction publishing has long understood its importance in developing scientists. This understanding goes back at least to the Heinlein juveniles in the 40s and 50s, with Damon Knight stating, Heinlein is doing something more than just earning a living at the work he does supremely well. He's preparing a whole generation, the generation that will live to see the year 2000, for the age of space that's as real to him now as it will be, must be, to them. Other books for juveniles, what we now know as young adult, were written during this period. Andre Norton, although more prolific in the fantasy genre, produced many works of YA science fiction. She was credited with writing female protagonists, but this appears to be solely within her fantasy works. Asimov also wrote a series of juveniles under the pseudonym Paul French. The YA science fiction field has now evolved with writers such as J.K. Rowling, Veronica Roth, Suzanne Collins, James Dashner, and Stephanie Meyer, being prolific authors whose works have all been adapted to the screen. My research involves finding the common ground between the three areas outlined above, using the data on STEM aspirations and analysing this in relation to the influence of science fiction will allow me to craft stories within the science fiction genre that are intended to inspire the study of STEM. I believe that STEM identity and sense of wonder are key concepts that will encourage readers to see themselves as scientists and instill a desire to find the answers to the bigger questions of the universe. Methodology. I won't go into too much detail here. This project uses qualitative research techniques in creative writing. It's a mixed method study utilising semi-structured interviews to gather both quantitative and qualitative data. The place of the creative work in the project as a whole is informed by practice by research, described by Candy as an original investigation undertaken in order to gain new knowledge, partly by means of practice and the outcomes of that practice. My research is composed of a creative element and a critical element. The project is split on a 70-30 ratio, with the creative project running at 56,000 words and the critical at 24. The creative element takes the form of a collection of short stories, which are produced in an iterative process with data collected from the interviews. From the interviews, a reading list of inspirational works has been created. These are read and analysed. In the reading, I'm looking to identify what about the stories could be used to write new works to inspire. The stories are then submitted to the participants, the first interviewees, for a discussion on whether they think they have the potential to be inspirational and what could be done to improve them. The iterative process will ensure that the right message is being put into the creative work. The act of writing also generates thoughts on how this inspiration can be achieved. Reflection upon the work will reinforce the research. In combination, the project considers how the consumption of science fiction has inspired STEM professionals to pursue their studies, careers, and research. Interviews are analysed using NVivo to determine aspects of science fiction informed or engage the reader's curiosity and the relationship to other factors such as author, subgenre, format, etc. My research project. My initial thought was to have one male and one female participant from each major strand of STEM, but it became clear early on that there were just too many possible careers to limit it to the interviews. So this study has been limited primarily to the space-related occupations, with the possibility of repeating the research in different areas at a later date. As my background is in space science, and through my association with groups such as the Initiative for Interstellar Studies and contacts I've made in the US through writing workshops, I've been able to secure interviews with a range of professionals within these fields. Using NVivo to analyse the data helps to pull themes and ideas from it. Many of the interviewees also write science fiction. Alistair Reynolds and Peter Hamilton are professional science fiction writers. Kathy Kipps, sorry, I've lost my voice. A NASA Genesis team member has just achieved an MFA in creative writing. Several of the other participants are published science fiction writers or involved in the science fiction writing community. As I just mentioned, the gentleman who runs Launchpad, a science workshop for science fiction writers. Being able to marry up the anecdotal with the practical application could provide a powerful tool in inspiring future generations that science is for them. Results so far. I've been very lucky with the participants I've been able to recruit. Seth Shostak, the chief astronomer at the SETI Institute, the science fiction writers Alistair Reynolds and Peter Hamilton. Reynolds, famous for his Revelation Space series, holds a PhD in astrophysics and worked as a research astronomer for the European Space Agency until he left to pursue writing full-time. Dr. Kathy Kitts, a science team member on the NASA Genesis Discovery mission, as I just mentioned, is also a science fiction writer. Dr. Nick Canas, a psychologist who has worked for NASA and is also a published science fiction author. Academics from MIT, the Open University, the universities of Lincoln, Nebraska, ironically, which is also in Lincoln, and Kansas, among other interviewees. The researchers identified 90 authors, 39 of whom were mentioned by more than one interviewee, and 107 novels, 35 of which were mentioned by more than one interviewee. And horror of horrors, I've put it upon myself as my research to read all 107 novels. I'm not all the way there yet, but I'm still working on it. And I've focused primarily on the most mentioned first. Perhaps the most interesting finding from the research was that you don't have to be a fan of the genre to be influenced by it. Sarah Seeger, Professor of Physics and Planetary Science at MIT, told me initially that she had been forced to watch science fiction as a kid because her older brother liked it and he had control of the remote control. She stated that it had definitely not influenced her career decisions. However, by the end of the interview, she changed her mind and said that actually, to her own surprise, she realised that she had been influenced by exposure to it, even though she hadn't realised it. Another finding that was the most consistent influence across the interviewees was Star Trek. Whilst it may appear that TV is the most influential form of science fiction by number of mentions, I don't believe this is a fair assessment, as all participants would likely have had access to it, whereas the huge variety of science fiction in the written form means that it was less likely that all the participants would have read the same works of fiction and therefore mentioned it. I also believe that written works have more potential to engage the imagination and to provide a sense of STEM identity, whilst TV is useful for providing role models, perhaps more than the written word. Practically, though, having a master's in script writing and being aware of the nature of episodic television, I knew it would be impossible to get a spec series produced, so it seemed a wasted effort to create one for my PhD, and hence the short story collection. The creative work. 12 of the interviewees mentioned the Heinlein juveniles, either generally or by specific titles within the series. Red Planet, Farmer in the Sky, and Have Spacesuit Will Travel were the most popular. One participant listed Red Planet as the most influential book from their childhood. Due to the time at which they were written, the science is quite dated. Martians and Venerians feature, and they reflect the sexist attitudes of the time, although Heinlein was more enlightened than a lot of his contemporaries and did write strong female characters in positions of power and authority. However, the sense of adventure and wonder they inspire are timeless, and despite Heinlein's intended audience, reviewers were known to compare the juveniles favourably with the regular adult science fiction of the year. Having conducted the interviews and read many of the inspirational works mentioned, the conclusion I have reached is that the Heinlein juveniles offer a good starting point for using my writing to explore and reflect on what is inspirational about science fiction and how we can write science fiction intended to inspire. Therefore, for my creative work, my short story collection will be formulated in response or homage to the Heinlein juveniles, bringing the science in the stories up to date. Interestingly, the Heinlein juveniles themselves were conceived as a modernisation of the Horatio Alger books that Heinlein had loved when he was growing up. Heinlein's works are classic and still stand today as fantastic works of science fiction. The reworking is to reflect current science. We had not been to Mars when Heinlein wrote his stories, nor to the moon. And to incorporate what may be considered awe-inspiring to today's reader, which is clearly going to be different to what inspired those in the 40s. The speed of scientific achievement in the current era requires greater feats to inspire, and my field notes from my science fiction workshops will aid engaging content to include. I intend to harness the zeitgeist of the golden age of science fiction, and Heinlein's work in particular, alongside modern science and achievements to create stories to inspire a new generation. The stories will then be reviewed by the interviewees for their thoughts on the inspirational value. Impact. It is hoped that future research can be conducted into the influence of science fiction on other STEM areas. Through anecdotal evidence, albeit in small numbers, it seems that biologists may not be influenced by science fiction, although what people perceive science fiction to be may contribute to this. Biologists may be influenced by science fiction like Jurassic Park without considering it to be science fiction. This research can form the basis of determining what is inspirational about science fiction, and this can then be used by future authors to craft more compelling works, and hopefully inspire more young people to consider a STEM career, whether by engaging their imaginations or by allowing them to see themselves as scientists or engineers, etc. It's also worth noting that I came to science in my 30s. At this point, I still had 35 to 40 years of career ahead of me. One way to address the STEM shortage is to retrain older generations, and science fiction could be used as a tool in this arsenal. And I've probably read this far too fast because I think I've finished a little bit early. I'm sorry, that's the end of my presentation.